The Silent Symphony, the last notes Theo Blackwood ever saw written, were his own. Black ink against white paper, climbing and falling like birds in flight. He remembered tracing his finger along the staff paper, feeling the wet ink smudge beneath. His touch. It was the beginning of his 10th symphony, what critics would later call his most ambitious work. But he would never see it completed. The autoimmune disease came swiftly, attacking his optic nerves with ruthless precision. By the time doctors diagnosed Stargardt's macular dystrophy, accelerated variant had already stolen most of his central vision. Within 3 months, the world-renowned composer was completely blind. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Josephine Winters. Everyone calls me Joe. I'll be your occupational therapist today." Her voice was the first thing he noticed, melodic but grounded, like a cello's middle register. Theo sat in the hospital room, his hands resting on the bed's edge, unsure where to place them in this new darkness. "Another therapist. How many does this make now?" he asked, not bothering to turn toward her voice. "I'm your 4th according to your chart." A rustling of papers. The others noted you were ... uncooperative. Theo scoffed. "They wanted me to learn Braille and use a cane like some helpless old man? I'm a composer. I need to see my music." "With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, you're a composer who needs to adapt." There was something refreshing about her directness. No pity, no hesitation. The silence stretched between them until Joe spoke again. "I hear you haven't left your room in 2 weeks. What's the point?" Theo's fingers curled into the bedsheet. "My career is over. 43 years old and finished." Beethoven was completely deaf when he composed his 9th symphony, Joe countered, her footsteps moving around the room. "I'd say you're being rather dramatic for someone with your reputation for innovation." Theo's head snapped up. "That's entirely different, is it? Last I checked. Music is about sound, not sight." For the first time since the darkness descended, Theo felt a flicker of something other than dispiritation. Yes, but also curiosity. "Your brother Gerald hired me privately," Joe continued. "He's concerned about you, and frankly, so am I. Your doctors say you're physically recovered enough to leave, but you refuse." "Gerald should mind his own business," Theo muttered. "He mentioned, you have a performance scheduled in 4 months. Had a performance? Cancel it." Joe's voice moved closer. "I don't think we should." Theo laughed bitterly. "What exactly do you propose? I stumble onto stage and play by memory? I compose symphonies, Ms. Winters, complex arrangements for dozens of instruments. And you'll continue to do so," she said firmly. "But first, we need to get you home." Following day, against his protests, Joe arrived with discharge papers and a car. Theo's penthouse overlooking the city had never felt so vast and treacherous. Every step was a potential collision, every reach a risk. "We'll map it together," Joe explained, guiding his hand along the wall. "Your space, your rules, but new methods." Over. The next week, Joe systematically transformed Theo's apartment, not by rearranging furniture, but by teaching him to navigate through sound and touch. She created audio cues at key points and textured markers on important surfaces. What Theo didn't know was that Joe had requested this assignment specifically. As a music therapist with a background in classical training, she had attended every one of Theo's New York performances. His music had carried her through her own dark times, including her recent diagnosis information she carefully kept to herself. On the 7th day, Joe guided Theo to his grand piano. "This is ridiculous," he protested. "Just sit," she insisted. "Music first, composition later. Remember what it feels like." Reluctantly, his fingers found the keys. The first notes were hesitant, awkward, but as minutes passed, muscle memory took over. The melody that emerged was raw and halting, nothing like his usual precise compositions. But it was music. It was music. When he finally stopped, the silence felt different, less empty. "Same time tomorrow, Mr. Blackwood?" Joe asked quietly. For the first time, Theo turned his face directly toward her voice. "Call me Theo," he said. "Tomorrow." Measured in notes, the grandfather clock in Theo's living room chimed 8 times, its deep resonance filling the apartment. Go. Joe smiled as Theo's head tilted slightly toward the sound, a small victory in his spatial awareness training.
Oh.
You're getting better at that, she observed, arranging sheet music on the piano stand. Not that Theo could see it, but old habits provided comfort. 2 months ago, you couldn't tell which direction sounds were coming from. Theo's fingers trailed over the piano keys without pressing them, a phantom exercise he'd developed. 2 months of your relentless drilling would improve anyone's hearing. What had begun as basic therapy sessions had evolved into something more complex. 5 days a week, Joe arrived at 9 and left at 5, helping Theo reconstruct his relationship with the world. The initial resistance had gradually given way to a tentative partnership. Have you thought more about the dictation software? Joe asked, pulling out her tablet. Dr. Fleming said it could be customized for musical notation. Theo frowned. Technology. Interpreting my music feels ... impersonal. It's more impersonal than not composing at all, Joe challenged, a slight wheeze catching in her throat. She quickly sipped water to cover it. The truth was, Joe's conditioner, rare form of pulmonary fibrosis, was worsening faster than her doctors had predicted. The experimental treatments were failing. On bad days, just climbing the stairs to Theo's penthouse left her breathless, but she'd become adept at hiding her symptoms. What was that? Theo asked, his head turning toward her. What was what? That sound from you? Joe placed her water glass down carefully. Just cleared my throat. Now, about the dictation software. You do that a lot lately. Clear your throat. Pause between sentences. This was the problem with training someone to notice auditory details. They noticed everything. Professional hazard of talking all day, Joe deflected. Now, I've been researching assistant composers who could help translate your ideas. I don't want an assistant, as Theo interrupted. But I've been thinking about what you said regarding Beethoven. Joe moved closer, intrigued. And perhaps I've been approaching this wrong. I've been trying to compose visually when I should be composing spatially. His hands spread out, as if mapping something invisible. Music exists in dimensions, pitch, duration, intensity. I need to feel these relationships rather than see them. Joe sat beside him on the piano bench, careful to maintain the professional distance she'd established. That sounds promising. How would you start? For the next hour, Theo explained his emerging method, a three-dimensional approach to composition. Using tactile references and audio layering, Joe recorded his ideas, asking questions that helped refine the concept. This was why Gerald had sought her out specifically. Her background in music theory made her uniquely qualified to understand Theo's creative process. What Gerald couldn't have known was how Theo's determination would affect Joe. On days when the pain medication barely touched her discomfort, watching him push through his own limitations gave her strength. Why did you become a therapist? Theo asked abruptly as they broke for lunch. Your knowledge of musical composition is conservatory level? Joe arranged the takeout containers by smell, guiding Theo's hand to each one. I studied at Juilliard, actually. Piano performance. What happened? Joe paused. This territory felt dangerous. Life intervened. I discovered I preferred helping others find their way back to music than performing myself. That's not the whole story, Theo said, accurately identifying the avocado roll by touch before dipping it in soy sauce. No, it's not, Joe admitted. But it's the story for today. As weeks passed, their routine solidified. Mornings for practical skills, afternoons for composition. Theo began working with a specially designed system, three-dimensional blocks representing musical phrases that he could arrange and rearrange. Joe would transcribe the results, playing back digital renderings for his approval. His 10th symphony began taking shape darker than his previous works, but with an emotional depth that surprised even him. One afternoon, as rain pelted against the windows, Theo's fingers stilled on the piano. You're not moving around as much today, he observed, and your breathing is shallow. Joe looked up from her notes, startled. She'd taken extra medication to mask her symptoms, but clearly not enough. I'm fine, she insisted, just tired. I may be blind, Joe, but I'm not stupid. Something's wrong. We should focus on finalizing the second movement. The symphony orchestra needs. Tell me the truth, Theo demanded, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Please. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the patter of rain and the soft hiss of Joe's labored breathing. Right, she finally admitted. It's my lungs. How bad? Joe stared at the rain-streaked windows. Bad enough. Theo's hand found hers on the piano bench, his fingers curling around hers with surprising accuracy. Is it treatable? It was supposed to be. Joe said, the truth releasing something tight in her chest. The treatments stopped working. How long have you known? About a year, before I met you. Theo absorbed this, his face a study in controlled emotion. And you still took this job? Dealing with a difficult, newly blind composer? For the first time since they'd met, Joe laughed genuinely. Strangely enough, you're the least exhausting part of my day. That evening, after Joe left, Theo sat at his piano for hours, playing fragments of melodies, his mind filled with questions he hadn't thought to ask before. What color was Joe's hair? What did her smile look like? Would he ever see either of these things? And most troublingly, why did these questions suddenly matter so much? The composition of Trust Dr. Patricia Valencia studied Theo's latest scans with guarded optimism. The inflammation has reduced significantly. If this continues, you'd be a candidate for the regenerative treatment. Theo sat perfectly still in the examination chair, his face unreadable behind dark glasses. What are the success rates? For cases like yours, about 60% chance of partial vision restoration, 20% for full restoration, and the risks? Dr. Valencia's chair creaked as she leaned forward, permanent damage to remaining functional cells, essentially trading your current stable condition for a chance at improvement, sighed him. Joe made notes on her tablet, her breaths carefully measured to hide her exertion. 3 months had passed since her confession, and Theo had insisted she accompany him to all medical appointments, ostensibly as his therapist, but increasingly as something more complicated. What's your professional opinion, Joe? Theo asked, turning toward her. This had become their pattern, Theo, involving her in decisions, valuing her analytical approach. It was a trust Joe found both rewarding and terrifying, especially as her own prognosis darkened. The research is promising, she answered carefully. The timing aligns with your symphony premiere in 2 months. Successful, you could potentially conduct it yourself. What she didn't say, if unsuccessful, he might lose his current ability to distinguish light and shadow, the last vestige of his sight. The same way she didn't mention her own recent hospitalization when he was busy with rehearsals. I want to try, Theo decided. Schedule the procedure. Later that evening, as snowflakes dusted Manhattan, they sat in Theo's living room reviewing the symphony recording from the day's rehearsal. Joe had started staying later, their professional relationship blurring into friendship and perhaps something more neither was ready to name. The oboe entry at measure 84 is still coming in late. Theo observed, his ear for timing undiminished by his blindness. I've noted it, Joe replied, fighting the urge to cough. Her oxygen levels had been dangerously low all day. Theo reached for his tea, but misjudged the distance. The cup tipped, hot liquid spilling across the coffee table. Damn it, he slammed, his fist down, frustration breaking through his carefully maintained composure. Joe quickly cleaned up the spill, her movements efficient despite her fatigue. It's just tea. It's not about the tea, Theo said, running a hand through his hair. It's about dependency. Limitations. I hate that everything even a simple cup of tea requires calculation. Joe sat beside him on the sofa, closer than usual. I understand limitations better than you might think. Your illness, Theo acknowledged. You never talk about it. Nothing much to say. The treatments bought time, but not enough. Theo's hand found hers in the darkness he inhabited. How much time? Joe looked at their intertwined fingers. 6 months, maybe less. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions. That's why you never mentioned your appearance, Theo finally said. Why you change the subject when I ask about visual details? Joe swallowed hard. It seemed irrelevant, given everything. It's not irrelevant to me, Theo said softly. I've created a picture of you in my mind, pieced together from your voice, your movements, The subtle scents of your shampoo and lotion, but I'd like to know if I'm right. Joe hesitated, then gave in. I'm 36, average height, brown hair shoulder length and usually tied back. Green eyes, freckles, Theo said with certainty. You have freckles. I can hear it in your voice. Joe laughed despite herself. That makes no sense whatsoever. I'm right though, aren't I? Yes, she admitted. Across my nose and cheeks. As the evening progressed, the professional boundaries between them continued to dissolve. Joe described herself in more detail, and Theo shared stories from his years touring globally, tales he'd never thought to tell her before. Why did you really take this job? Theo asked as midnight approached. The truth this time. Joe considered lying, then decided against it. Your third symphony. I was in my second year at Juilliard when it premiered. I'd just been diagnosed in earlier, more treatable version of what eventually returned. That piece, ... it pulled me through my darkest days. Theo's expression softened. You were a fan. Was someone whose life you changed without knowing it, Joe corrected. When your brother mentioned you needed someone with musical background, I practically begged for the assignment. So I've been receiving therapy from a groupie. Theo's teasing tone couldn't mask his genuine surprise. A groupie with impeccable professional credentials, Joe countered, smiling despite the tears threatening to fall. The next morning, as Joe helped Theo prepare for his pre-surgical assessment, an uncomfortable truth hung between them, his potential. Return to sight coincided with her declining health. If the treatment worked, he would finally see her just as her illness became impossible to hide. Are you afraid? Joe asked, as they waited for the car that would take them to the hospital, of the procedure. No, Theo answered. Of what comes after. Terrified, Joe squeezed his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them. Might look different than you remember. It's not the world I'm concerned about seeing, Theo replied quietly. It's making up for lost time. Neither mentioned what they both understood, that time was the one thing they might not have. Seeing beyond the removal of bandages was a precise ritual. Dr. Valencia worked methodically, her voice calm and measured. Remember, Mr. Blackwood, even if the treatment was successful, your vision will be blurry at first. Colors might appear. Washed out, and depth perception will take time to return. Theo sat rigid in the examination chair, his hands gripping the armrests. Joe stood nearby, her own anxiety carefully masked behind professional composure. The procedure had gone smoothly. 3 weeks ago, initial tests showed promising neural responses. But this would be the moment of truth, the first time Theo would attempt to see since the experimental treatment. Ready? Dr. Valencia asked, removing the final layer of gauze. Yes, Theo answered, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Open your eyes slowly, the doctor instructed. Light will be intense. Joe held her breath, consciously touching the oxygen concentrator hidden in her bag, a new necessity she'd been reluctant to adopt. In the weeks of Theo's recovery, her own health had deteriorated significantly, requiring supplemental oxygen. For even minimal exertion, Theo's eyelids fluttered, then opened slightly before immediately closing again. Too bright, he murmured. That's a good sign. Dr. Valencia adjusted the room's lighting. Try again. This time Theo's eyes opened wider, blinking rapidly. Its expression shifted from concentration to astonishment. I can see light. Shapes, he whispered. Blurry, but... There. Dr. Valencia conducted a series of test-tracking movement, identifying large objects, distinguishing between colors. With each successful response, hope bloomed in the room. Treatment appears to be working, she confirmed. Your optic nerves are responding beyond our expectations. With time and therapy, you may regain significant functional vision. Theo nodded absently, his attention fixed on something across the room. Joe? He called. Where are you? Joe hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. The illness had left visible marks: weight loss, darkened circles beneath her eyes, the pallor of chronic oxygen deprivation. She dressed carefully that morning in a blue blouse. Theo had once said he liked the texture of, but nothing could disguise the truth of her condition. I'm here, she answered, stepping forward into his field of vision. Theo squinted, clearly struggling to bring her into focus. I can't. You're just a shape right now. Mr. Blackwood will need several weeks before facial recognition becomes possible, Dr. Valencia explained. For now, he'll recognize people primarily by voice and general appearance. Relief and disappointment. Warred within Joe. That's wonderful progress, she said professionally, ignoring the selfish part of her that was grateful for the reprieve of a few more weeks before. Theo truly saw her. The following days established new patterns. Theo's vision improved incrementally from distinguishing shapes to identifying objects, from seeing colors to recognizing simple text. Joe modified their sessions to incorporate visual rehabilitation while continuing work on the symphony, now just 3 weeks from premiere. Neither mentioned the third presence in the room, Joe's illness, increasingly impossible to ignore. Portable oxygen concentrator became a necessity rather than a precaution. Her once efficient movements grew measured and deliberate, conserving precious energy one afternoon. As spring sunshine streamed through the penthouse windows, Theo worked at the piano while Joe transcribed notes. His vision, though improving daily, still couldn't manage the precision required for musical notation. The second violins need to emphasize the counter melody here, he instructed, playing the passage. When Joe didn't immediately respond, he looked up. His vision, still blurry, but significantly improved, registered something alarming. Joe sat motionless, her tablet fallen to her lap, her breathing shallow and labored. Joe, alarm sharpened his voice. She blinked slowly, focusing with visible effort. Sorry, just got lightheaded for a moment. Theo crossed to her, his movements more confident than they had been in months. Up close, he could see details that had been obscured before: the pronounced hollows beneath her cheekbones, the blue tinge to her lips. You need a hospital, he stated, already reaching for his phone. No, Joe protested weakly. The premiere's 3 weeks away. There's too much to finish. The symphony doesn't matter, Theo insisted. It's all that matters, Joe countered with unexpected vehemence. It's your return, your legacy. And what about your legacy? Theo demanded. What about the time you have left? The question hung between them, painful in its directness. This is how I want to spend it, Joe finally said. Helping you complete what you started. Theo studied her face, still indistinct but becoming clearer each day. Then we finish it together. But on one condition. What's that? You move in here? No more exhausting commutes? No more hiding symptoms? Let's not waste it on pretense. Let's not waste it on pretense. Joe wanted to argue, but lacked the strength. The truth was, her apartment had become an impossible challenge. The stairs, the distance to the hospital, the crushing solitude. Okay, she agreed softly. That evening, Gerald helped arrange for Joe's essential belongings to be brought to Theo's guest room. The new arrangement was ostensibly practical composer and assistant, working efficiently toward an impending deadline, but all three knew it represented something more profound. As days passed, Theo's vision continued improving alongside Joe's. Decline. The symphony neared completion, a work unlike anything Theo had composed before, filled with emotional complexity that reviewers would later struggle to categorize. One morning, Theo entered the kitchen to find Joe at the window, oxygen, tubes in place, watching the sunrise. He paused, struck by the clarity with which he could now see her silhouette against the golden light. You're beautiful, he said simply. Joe turned, startled. You can see me now? Enough to know I was right about the freckles? He moved closer, studying her face with newfound ability. Your eyes are exactly the green I imagined. Joe self-consciously touched the oxygen tube. This isn't exactly how I pictured you seeing me for the first time. Theo took her hands in his. I've been seeing you for months, Joe. This is just confirmation of what I already knew. The premiere loomed 1 week away. Joe had arranged everything from the specialized conductor's podium with tactile markers to the lighting designed to accommodate Theo's still sensitive vision, which she couldn't control, was her own rapidly failing body. I might not make it to the performance, she admitted that night as they reviewed the final arrangements. Theo, whose vision now allowed him to read large print and recognize faces, looked up sharply. Don't say that. It's not pessimism. It's pragmatism. Dr. Levin says my lung function is below 30% now. Theo set aside the score, moving to sit beside her on the sofa they'd come to share during evening discussions. "Then we move the premiere up," he decided. "You can't reschedule the Boston Symphony Orchestra on a whim." "Watch me," Theo said with the confidence that had made him famous. If not the orchestra, then something smaller. A private performance. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. Gerald, upon hearing their dilemma, made a single phone call to the symphony's principal conductor explaining the unique circumstances. By that evening, a plan had formed: a special rehearsal performance, 3 days hence, with a small invited audience. "Consider it a dress rehearsal with witnesses," Gerald explained. "The official premiere remains unchanged, but this gives you both what matters most." As Joe's condition worsened, Theo rarely left her side, splitting his time between final symphony preparations and ensuring her comfort. The composition that had begun in darkness was concluding in a strange new light, one that illuminated truths neither had been prepared to face. "I used to think losing my sight was the worst possible fate for a composer," Theo confessed the night before the special performance. "Now I understand there are far more devastating losses." Joe, propped against pillows and conserving her limited strength, reached for his hand. "We found each other because of what we lost, not despite it." "I wish we had more time," Theo said, the words inadequate for the emotion behind them. Joe smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired features. "We used what we had well. Your symphony proves that." Theo looked at her, truly saw her, and understood what his returning vision had been teaching him all along. Some things could only be properly seen when first experienced in darkness. The final movement, the rehearsal hall of the Boston Symphony. Orchestra glowed with subdued lighting, concession to Theo's still sensitive vision. 60 musicians arranged their scores while a small audience of 30, specially invited guests, settled into seats near the front. Theo stood backstage, his formal attire a stark contrast to the anxiety evident in his expression. His vision, though improved enough to navigate the stage, remained compromised, color slightly muted, details softened at the edges. Yet he could see what mattered most. Joe, seated in the front row, oxygen tank discreetly positioned beneath her chair. "Everything is prepared," Gerald assured him, adjusting Theo's tie. "The orchestra has rehearsed extensively. The tactile markers are in place on the podium." Theo nodded absently, his attention fixed on Joe. The past 3 days had brought a precipitous decline, her breathing more labored, her movements increasingly limited. This performance wasn't merely a musical premiere. It was a race against an unforgiving clock. "She made it," Theo said softly. Gerald followed his gaze. "She's stronger than anyone anticipated." Stage manager approached, indicating it was time. Theo took a deep breath and walked onto the stage with measured steps. His movements balanced between his old confidence and new caution. Applause greeted him, warm and intimate in the small space. Theo acknowledged it with a slight bow before taking his position at the conductor's podium. A specialized platform featured subtle raised markers that would guide his hands should his vision blur during the performance. His eyes found Joe again. Even with his imperfect sight, he could see her smile, the same one he'd first heard in her voice months ago. Theo raised his baton. The orchestra stilled, instruments poised. The symphony began softly, a solo clarinet expressing a searching, uncertain melody. Gradually, other instruments joined, building complexity and counterpoint. The first movement portrayed disorientation and loss. Musical phrases fragmented and seeking resolution as Theo conducted. Memories surfaced, Joe guiding his hands along walls to map his apartment. The frustration of early composition attempts. The first time he heard her breathing falter. The moment he asked her to stay. The second movement emerged from the first without pause, faster, more urgent, with percussive elements suggesting the rhythm of a racing heart. This was adaptation, survival. The frantic adjustment to changed circumstances. Theo's conducting grew more assured as the music progressed. His hands, once uncertain in the darkness, now moved with precision and authority, drawing nuanced performances from each section. Occasionally, his fingers brushed against the tactile markers Joe had designed, small reminders of the bridge. she'd built between his past and present. The third movement began with interweaving melodies between woodwinds and strings, conversation, a connection forming across instrumental voices. Here was the heart of the symphony. The emotional core that critics would later describe as achingly intimate yet universally resonant. Theo risked a glance at Joe during a measured pause. Her eyes were closed, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Oxygen mask temporarily removed so nothing would obstruct her experience of the music. The fourth movement arrived with unexpected brightness, major keys after prolonged minor passages, hopeful phrases emerging from darkness, yet underneath ran a persistent, melancholy counter-melody, a reminder that some shadows remain even in the brightest light. As the final movement began, Theo's vision momentarily blurred emotion rather than medical regression. He touched the podium markers, steadying himself before guiding the orchestra into the symphony's conclusion. This movement encompassed everything that came before: loss and discovery, darkness and light, separation and connection. The musical themes from earlier movements returned transformed, speaking to one another in complex harmonies. The composition built toward its climax, instruments layering upon one another in structured intensity. Then, just before the expected resolution, came an unexpected solo, a single violin playing a simple, haunting melody that silenced all other instruments. This was the passage Theo had composed the night after Joe moved into his home, a musical portrait of her essence that required no visual reference. The orchestra rejoined, supporting rather than overwhelming the violin's voice. Together, they moved toward the symphony's final measures, not a triumphant conclusion, but a peaceful acceptance. Beauty acknowledged alongside loss. As the last note faded, silence filled the hall. Then came applause, tentative at first, quickly growing into a standing ovation. Critics in attendance would later struggle to articulate what made the performance so powerful: the technical brilliance of the composition, certainly, but also something more elusive, an emotional authenticity rarely captured in contemporary classical music. Theo bowed, acknowledging the orchestra before turning toward the audience. His improving vision allowed him to see Joe clearly, now her radiant smile, visible despite the oxygen mask she'd replaced. Afterward, as musicians and guests mingled, Joe remained seated, her strength depleted by the emotional experience. Theo knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "It was perfect," she whispered. "Because of you," he replied. "All of it, the music, the performance, my being here at all, it exists because of you." Joe's eyes, bright despite her exhaustion, held his gaze. "I think we saved each other." 3 days later, the official premiere took place to critical acclaim. Joe watched from a private box, her hospital bed specially arranged for the occasion. Theo conducted with confidence, his vision having improved enough to rely less on the tactile markers. Reviews hailed the symphony as Theo Blackwood's masterpiece, a triumphant return after his year of darkness. What the critics couldn't know was how literally the music charted his journey from isolation to connection, from loss to discovery. In the months that followed, as Joe's condition worsened, Theo rarely left her side. He arranged for home hospice care, converting his living room into a space where Joe could still experience the city views she loved, while receiving necessary medical support. They spent their remaining time together, in conversation, music, and increasingly comfortable silence. Theo often played for her not his famous compositions, but simple improvisations that spoke directly to their shared experience. On a clear autumn morning, as golden light filled the apartment, Joe asked Theo to describe what he could see. "Everything," he answered, his once damaged vision now recovered enough to capture the scene. "The sky is perfectly blue. The trees in the park are turning red and gold. Your freckles are more pronounced in this light." Joe smiled, her hand finding his. "I'm glad you can see it all now." "I started seeing clearly long before my vision returned," Theo said softly. "You taught me that." When Joe passed 3 days later, it was peacefully, with Theo reading aloud beside her. The book remained open on his lap long after he realized she was gone. his newly restored vision allowing him to witness both his greatest loss and the profound gift her presence had been. 6 months later, Theo Blackwood established the Josephine Winters Foundation for Music Therapy. It's focused particularly on bringing musical education to visually impaired children and adults. The foundation's first initiative funded a special program at the hospital where he and Joe had first met. Critics noted a change in Theo's subsequent compositions, still complex and innovative, but with an emotional depth previously absent from his work. When asked about this evolution in his artistic approach, Theo's answer was simple. I learned that some things can only be truly seen when first experienced in darkness, and some melodies are heard most clearly in silence. On opening night of each new symphony, a single seat in the front row remained empty, a private acknowledgement of the woman who had helped him find his way back to music. Ending so taught him to see with more than just his eyes.